The energy media community knows that I spend a lot of time on narratives around energy and climate change. And well, as it turns out, so does Fatih Birol, who is the executive director of the International Energy Agency. And just today, he's penned an op-ed titled Three Myths About the Global Energy Crisis. And I'm going to talk to veteran energy journalist and writer Shawn McCarthy about that piece. So welcome to the interview, Shawn.
Hi, Markham. Thanks.
Well, this is really interesting because Birol said that he thinks the narratives, the three narratives, are wrong and dangerously so. And I think that he's trying to elevate the seriousness with which we approach these. So let's start with the first one, which is myth number one: Moscow is winning the energy battle. What's your take on what Birol has written about that?
Well, I mean, I guess it's understandable that some people are writing that Moscow is winning the energy battle because we see what's happening in Europe with natural gas and oil prices crippling a lot of people and helping to drive inflation, I think, right across the world. So, in the short term, there has been some advantage to the Russians. Their exports are down. But the increase in prices have more than made up for that, and their revenues are up. So they have had like oil producers around the world, they have had a windfall from the increased price. Now, he argues that that is a short-term phenomenon only, and that over time, the Europeans are looking at further sanctions and cutting off Russian oil completely. And in the medium term to longer term, the sanctions will degrade the Russians' ability to produce oil, and so in the long term, it's not a win. But I think of the three myths, this one is probably the most debatable.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I've read a number of pieces on what Putin's strategy here, what his political strategy, his grandiose dreams of bringing back the Russian Empire, sort of rebuilding the Soviet Union in some respects. But there's a really fundamental issue here. And I've been in business for most of my career. And the one thing you don't do is really annoy your customers.
Well, yeah, right, exactly. And I went to Russia in 2009 when they were having earlier problems with Ukraine, and they had stopped flow of gas through Ukraine, and they were at great pains to reassure their European customers that they were not going to use energy as a political tool, that they were in a commercial dispute with Ukraine that could be solved, and that the Europeans could rely on them. Obviously the temperature has increased dramatically, and they're responding to sanctions imposed on them. The other thing I think about sanctions is, I mean, in no world can we imagine that the Russians could invade Ukraine and Europe and North America would say, we're going to just keep buying your oil. There are no repercussions. There are no sanctions. So, have the sanctions hurt Russian energy customers? Absolutely. But what was the alternative to that? I think it's a good question to ask.
Now, LNG gets a lot of attention, or has been since Russia invaded Ukraine, and the industry and Alberta Premier Jason Kenney kind of leading the chorus of we should increase Canadian LNG capacity so that we can serve Europe. And what's interesting about this point that Birol makes in his op-ed is that Russia was banking on LNG, building out its LNG capacity to diversify its markets away from Europe. And so not only has it, alienated its biggest customer in the EU, but it also now, because the Western companies aren't going to deal with it or can't because of the sanctions, they basically eliminated any chance of succeeding in that LNG buildup for the rest of the world or for the rest of the global market.
Well, I mean, there's plenty of customers for Russian gas once they start shipping it. I mean, the sanctions are not globally enforced. They turned for their oil. They turned to India. They turned to China to some degree. Middle East is buying Russian product and Russian crude. So I think there would be customers. I covered the for a long time, first the proposal and then the actual construction of the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline that the Americans were warning for years and years, going back to the Bush administration, that the Europeans and the Germans in particular were making a big mistake by becoming increasingly dependent on the Russian. But it was the cheapest way to go. Pipeline gas from Russia is cheaper than LNG from anywhere, and just because of the capital costs required. So and there's always this theory, I think, and I mean that if you tie somebody in commercially to your world, it creates incentives for everybody to get along. And I think that is something that we're going to have to revisit. And it's true with China too. A lot of the China policy for the last 20 years has been, integrate them into the global economy, and they will have too much to lose to get belligerent. Well, we'll see.
Now, myth number two is that today's global energy crisis is a clean energy crisis, and Birol calls that absurd. He says that he talks to energy policymakers around the world all the time, and their only regret is that they didn't start in on wind and solar and storage sooner.
And efficiency.
Yes,
he's very big on energy efficiency. But yes.
So what do you make of that claim that the energy crisis is a clean energy crisis?
I don't think I understand that is out there. I haven't seen it as much in this round as I had in the previous run-up. I mean, gas prices in Europe were climbing dramatically well before the Russian invasion. And you did see people attributing that to too much reliance on renewables, that they needed the gas and that the gas wasn't being produced. So I think that he took that on head on. And yeah, I mean, when you're one of the largest oil and gas producers are essentially out of the Western markets, I haven't seen anybody arguing with a straight face that this is, and except the true ideologues, that this is the result of too much reliance on clean energy.
Well, one of the things that's very clear to me, because like you, I receive newsletters from industry analysts, oil and gas industry analysts all the time. And they take every opportunity when there's a stumble or there's some, whether it's a big crisis or it's a minor problem, they take great pains to point out, the problems that this has caused and try to tie it to clean energy. But I think that there is a principle here that is true of other energy transitions, and it's certainly true with this one, is that disruption is a messy process, and that you don't always get the rise of new energy sources integrated smoothly without these kinds of disruptions and shortages and high prices sometimes and so on, and all exacerbated, of course, by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But what do you think? Disruption is just a messy process, and
it is a messy process, but I think we need to be very careful. And I would not be at all surprised to see a new British Prime Minister come in and put a whole lot of subsidies on energy. I mean, we saw it in Ontario, and it was far less dramatic a situation, but where the narrative, as you pointed out at the top of the show, became clean energy, renewable energy is driving prices, and therefore we need to shut down renewable energy. Now they've gone back on that a bit, but when that takes hold, and there are a lot of very powerful interests that want that narrative out there, it becomes far more difficult politically to carry on. And I think we're going to see it in spades in California, as their grid is really under stress because of the terrible heat wave they're having.
Myth number 3, according to Birol, is the energy crisis is a huge setback that will hinder us from tackling climate change. And one of the things he points to is all of the governments that have recently gone all in on clean energy technologies. The EU has the Repower EU plan. The Americans just passed the Inflation Reduction Act. But Japan has got a GX green transformation plan. China continues to build renewable capacity and the manufacturing capacity to go along with clean energy technologies at a record pace. I mean, I think what's becoming apparent here is 2 things. One is that this is a new industrial revolution. I mean, all kinds of writers have talked about the 4th industrial revolution, the 6th long wave of innovation, all of that kind of stuff. But we're really ramping up at this point. And secondly, governments are all in on this as well, particularly in the wealthier countries, and a lot of it is to tackle climate change. So is that an issue in the narrative, because that some people just haven't got the fact yet, they don't understand the inevitability of this switch off fossil fuels and into clean energy?
Well, I think that there is an inevitability to it, but the pacing is a real issue, and politics is who's in this year versus who's out next year, right? The Inflation Reduction Act came in, and it had a whole lot of support for green energy. But if the Republicans take the White House and the Congress, who knows? We see there is a real backlash and a defense of the fossil fuel economy coming from Republicans and from Alberta to some degree. And to me, the fundamental issue is we are seeing the impacts of climate change in spades now. I mean, you look at Pakistan and the horrible heat wave they had that preceded it, the horrible floods they're now having. The Chinese are very worried about their rivers and water. I mean, there's drought in the US that is drying up water supplies, and a terrible heat wave in California right now. These are only going to become more and more apparent, and I think there will always be the ideologues, there will always be the deniers that will push back. I think the world is going to be moving apace just because of the reality and the risks that the financial community, for example, will have to take on board as climate change becomes increasingly troublesome.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There was a study or a poll, I guess, in my inbox this morning from Yale University, and arguing that more and more Americans, over 50% now, are changing their view of climate change based upon the things that you mentioned, the drought in California. It's the evidence of it now that they can see, oh my goodness, we need to now move. So it seemed, and there are polls in Canada that clearly show that a majority of conservative voters even want a party, their party, to have a credible climate plan.
Right.
So again, it seems like we've moved far beyond the inflection point on this issue, and there's no going back.
There's no going back, but I would still, I wouldn't underestimate the power of the foot draggers and the people that want to push back, and the ideologues who are straight up still denying, from the Joe Olivers of the world to prominent Republicans in the United States. There's certainly a number of people in Canada, influential people in the media that are still, if they don't outright deny, they might as well, because they don't think anything needs to be done about it or should be done about it or whatever. I don't know. I'm going to be really curious to see how Pierre Poilievre, who apparently is on the doorstep of being announced new conservative leader in Canada, deals with the issue, because as you say, there seems to be a growing acceptance of it. It has been said, and I think it is debatable, but it has been said that you cannot win the suburbs of Toronto without a credible climate policy. What credible means is again debatable, but I think there is increasing pressure on conservative parties to be seen to be serious about it.
Shawn, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks, Mark, and see you again.